much. It's a good attendance. Thank you very much all. I'm one of the trustees of the John Dennys Memorial Fund, and I'd like to welcome you to this 14th lecture at the AA. 14 lectures is the beginning of a tradition, and I think to put things in perspective, and since this school has been running now for over 100, well, nearly 150 years, I presume, and when I thought of this, I was reminded how old some people are, because in that corner over there, 50 years ago, I think this month, I had my first brush with the AA. I had my entrance interview. You didn't have examinations. This was in the war. And Frederick Gibbard, many of you remember him, I'm sure, was principal, a man with a large moustache and generally red socks. He looked at my offering, which I'm sure was amazing naive compared with today. It was a series of grubby little 6B life drawings from my local art school. And also, I did admit to an ability to make things. So that was in 50 years ago, if you can work backwards, quite a long while ago. 5 years later, I met John Dennys when we both returned from our wartime experiences. He did a great deal and was rewarded and was a very excellent soldier. And then we were all back at the AA, and we were what you would now call mature students. The AA had 5 separate years, not that surprising, but what was surprising, there were probably between 100 and 150 students in each of them. We used number 7 Bedford Square, which is across the square, and in those days, Morwell Street, which is in behind here, was a bomb site, and we had a sort of barrack-type building, and the AA workshop, which I seem to remember. We built, John and I became friends, and with another student from the AA, Brian Cassidy, we started a private practice working for others during the day and ourselves at any other times available. And this was, again, I suspect, not quite the tradition that happens now. Our first job, if I remember rightly, together was supervision only for the erection of a prefabricated timber coat house. Now, whether that means anything to anybody, but it's a sort of 4-foot modular thing, and we had to do the supervision, which was a bit unnecessary. I think we got 70 quid for it, so that's just worth it. When we finished, we all took jobs, and this is when John opted for returning to the AA. And of course, he never really left. I mean, you could think of his career here. And just again, with a reflection on time, which I like to refer to, is I think I went and worked for the ACP, and my wages were £8, 10 shillings per week. And John, I think, had slightly less, because he had the honour, of course, of working for the AA. And financial losses were, then, I'm sure, an honour. John continued one of the basic concepts of the AA, those who taught were practicing architects. He continued through the various levels of involvement, culminating in president. This he did at a very difficult period in the AA's history. And his untimely death robbed us a very talented teacher, and in my case, a dear friend and partner. These lectures are subsidized by a fund set up by his students and his friends, so that John's prime interest in teaching architecture at AA can continue in the form of an annual lecture. Lavinia Dennys would like to have come this evening, but she asked me to pass on her delight that you're all here, and I hope that she perhaps comes next year. I hope you enjoy this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
The subject of this year's John Dennys lecture is Daniel Liebeskind's project for the Jewish Museum to be added to the Museum of Berlin. This is a work of formative significance for architecture at the end of the 20th century. It is, on reflections of all of Daniel's conceptual experiments, from his end space drawings of '79 to the infinite harmonies of chamber works, on through the dreadful disturbances of the future in Theatrum Mundi, and on, all were preparations for this most profound conceptual task. In the mid-'80s, John Haydick saw clearly the penetration of Liebeskind's imagination. His work, he wrote, turns the body inside out, and we see the soul being discarded. We too easily dismiss that which we don't understand. In these increasingly Uncertain times, we fail to recognize the exceptional courage needed to transform the bonds of present reality. Libeskind's project is a work of exceptional courage. Detach what you see from all the confused gyrations around the idea of disorder. This is an exact construction. No other problem in this century calls so clearly for the undermining of past realities. No other problem is so clearly matched to the necessary political subversion of deconstruction. Nothing in the history of Western architectural form would do other than distort and conceal the actual reality of this museum. Libeskind's task in the Berlin Jewish Museum was to find an architecture which could speak the unspeakable. Daniel Libeskind.
The discussion about the necessity of a Jewish museum in Berlin as a part of Berlin's own history was in process for almost a quarter of a century. Many eminent experts and Holocaust survivors discussed this issue at the Aspen Institute conferences and the implications of building a Jewish museum in Berlin. The conclusions reached by these eminent people after a series of conferences, seminars, and lectures were ones which were formulated into the brief for the competition for the extension of the Berlin Museum, which was held in 1988-1989. Over 170 architects participated in this competition, which I was fortunate to win. On November 9th, 1992, a politically significant date in German history and in Berlin's history, with the commemoration of the Kristallnacht and the fall of the wall, the groundbreaking for this museum took place with the Lord Mayor and the Senators of Culture and Building presiding. It is only now, some 4 years after the conclusion of the competition and 50 years after the Holocaust, that the construction of the museum has begun in March of this year. These last 4 years have seen 3 changes in government and enormous financial pressures on the restructuring of a reunified Germany and a reunified Berlin. There was, in 1991, a concerted attempt to block through delay the construction of this museum, ostensibly for financial reasons. Important political organizations in Germany and prominent German politicians, such as the late Willy Brandt, Berlin senators, Senator Nagel of Building and Senator Rolf Mamin, as well as international politicians such as Jacques Lang, Teddy Kollek from Jerusalem, organizations such as the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and indeed the Israel government itself, protested that the delay of this project is an expedient way of forgetting Berlin's own history. In October of 1991, the Parliament of Berlin made a dramatic reversal and voted unanimously to begin the site clearance and construction of the museum in 1993. With such a major decision to build a museum of approximately 115 million Deutschmarks, the city of Berlin has decided to make it clear to the world at large, especially in these times of violent antagonism and attacks against foreigners and Jews, that this project stands as a representation of a new Berlin and of a new Germany. When I was invited by the Berlin Senate in 1988 to participate in this competition for the extension of the Berlin Museum with the Jewish Museum Department, as it was called, I felt that this was not a program I had to research or a concept I had to invent, but rather one in which I was implicated from the very beginning, having lost most of my own family in the Holocaust and myself having been born only a few hundred kilometers east of Berlin in Lodz, Poland. My family was one of those who sought refuge in Israel in the late 50s before emigrating to the United States. Now, in turn, I and my family have moved back to Berlin in order to realize the building of this particular project. There are three basic ideas which form the foundation of the museum. First, the impossibility of understanding the history of Berlin without understanding the enormous economic, political, and cultural contribution made by the Jewish citizens of Berlin. Second, the necessity to physically and spiritually integrate the meaning of the Holocaust into the consciousness and memory of the city. And third, that only through the acknowledgement and the incorporation of this absence or the void of Jewish life in Berlin today can the history of Berlin and of Europe have a humane future. The official name of the project is the extension of the Berlin Museum with the Jewish Museum Department. But I have called it from the beginning Between the Lines. I call it this because it is a project about two different lines of thinking, organization and relationship. One is a straight line, but broken into many fragments. The other is a tortuous line, but continuing indefinitely. The site is on Lindenstrasse, in the new and old center of Berlin, next to the distinguished Collegian House, which was the first courthouse, Prussian courthouse in Berlin, at present the Berlin Museum. At the same time that there was this actual visible site, I felt that there was an invisible matrix of connections, a connection of relationships between figures of Germans and Jews. Even though the competition was held before the wall fell, I felt that one binding feature which crossed East and West was the relationships of Germans to Jews. Certain people, and particularly certain writers, composers, artists, and poets, formed the link or marriage between the Jewish tradition and German culture. I found this connection, and I plotted an irrational matrix which would yield reference to the emblematics of the compressed and distorted star, the yellow star that was so frequently worn on this very site. That is the first aspect of the project. I was always interested in the music of Arnold Schoenberg, and in particular in the period when he was professor in Berlin, just before he was dismissed from that position. His greatest work, which he was working on at the time, I believe is the opera which he called Moses and Aaron, which he could not complete. For some reason, the logic of the written text could not be musically completed. At the end of the opera, Moses doesn't sing. He just speaks, and he says, "O word, thou word," and one can actually understand it as a text, because when there is no singing, the missing word uttered by Moses, which is the call for the word, is understood clearly. That is the second aspect of this project. The third aspect was my own interest in the names and numbers associated with those persons who were deported from Berlin during those fatal years we now call the Holocaust. I asked for and received from Bonn two enormous volumes called the Gedenkbuch. They are incredibly impressive because they contain thousands and thousands of pages which contain nothing but names, lists and lists of names, dates of birth, dates of deportation, and presumed places where these people were murdered. So I looked for certain names of Berliners and where they died, some in Lodz, in Riga, and in other places. The fourth aspect of the work is formed by a reading of Walter Benjamin's Einbahnstrasse, the one-way street. And this aspect I have incorporated into a continuous sequence of 60 sections along a zigzag, each of which represents one of the stations of the star described in the text of Walter Benjamin, in the text which deals with the apocalypse of Berlin. In specific terms, the building measures more than 12,000 square meters. The building goes underneath the existing museum building, crisscrosses and materializes itself independently on the outside. The existing building is tied to the extension only underground, preserving the contradictory autonomy of both the old Collegian House building and the new building, but only on the surface, while binding the two buildings together in depth in the underground in the form of a kind of labyrinth. And in this labyrinth, there are three major crisscrossing axes which programmatically have three different functions. One axis leads to a dead end, the so-called Holocaust Memorial. The second axis leads outdoor to the E.T.A. Hoffmann Garden and represents programmatically the exile and emigrations of Jews from Berlin outside to other parts of the world. And the third axis, the longest one, leads to the main circulation system and to the exhibition floors above in the Berlin Museum and the Jewish Museum, which is to show the history of Berlin from 1870 to the present. Running all the way through this zigzag of the new extension is a void, a straight line whose impenetrability forms a kind of central axis. This void is traversed through bridges or tunnels which connect the various parts of the museum. This void or absence is something which every participant in the museum will experience walking through the collections and of the history of Berlin. On the walls of the void will be the names, approximately 200,000, of those deported and murdered Jewish citizens of that city. The void, therefore, and the invisible are the structural features which have been gathered in this particular space of Berlin and exposed also in an architecture in which the unnamed remains, in the names which keep still. It is a new type of organization which is organized around a center which is not, around what is not visible. And what is not visible is the richness of the former Jewish heritage of Berlin, since physically it has disappeared and turned into ashes. I believe that this project joins architecture to questions that are now relevant to all human beings. To this end, I sought to create an architecture for a new time which would reflect a different understanding of history, a new understanding of museums, and a new understanding of the relationship between program and architectural form. Therefore, this museum is not only a response to a particular program, but an emblem of hope. It underscores the reality that the Holocaust was not the last word in Jewish history, nor in the history of Berlin. May I have the first slide, please? This is an old Baroque plan of part of Berlin, leading to the Rondell, the three main streets, Friedrichstrasse, Wilhelmstrasse, and Lindenstrasse. Up there, you see Brandenburg Gate and Unter den Linden. You see here the Platz, the Academy of Schinkel, and on axis with Markgrafenstrasse stands the Collegian House, the courthouse, at present the Berlin Museum. And the site now for the museum is to the south of this parcel of land. That is the site approximately as it looks today, although this photograph was taken when the wall was still there. It's very close to the wall. Here is the wall running through here. One is looking north to Alexanderplatz, where you see the tower. Here is the Collegian House, Bad Gerlach. Here is the southern site, large triangular piece. Here is Lindenstrasse, which you notice has been curved from its original straightforward direction towards the Rondell in the Scharoun planning of Berlin and made to curve away from that concentration to become a kind of a highway. And if you look at this photograph, it approximately mirrors the incredible history of Berlin as a city. You see the new housing of IBA here to the north, but you don't see yet here the massive housing projects of the 60s and 70s. That's Gerlach's building, and I should say that Gerlach was also the architect and the planner of the Rondell and of all the main geometric squares of Berlin. Here is an earlier photograph of the site, which still had temporary housing in the 70s. There's the site. The Berlin Museum, which was reconstructed, it was badly damaged during the war. It was reconstructed as a listed building. And what is interesting is, as you look east, you see the very massive housing developments which bracket the building. It's not a typical museum building like on the museum island. It's a museum which is in a kind of catastrophic zone of the city, which has never been able to reconcile the diverse histories into some pattern. And this is my own, well, it's the kernel of the star matrix that I spoke. It's the void actually runs along this line straight through the center of the building, and it connects Oranienburger Strasse number 1, which is here the Aleph. It appears in a poem by Paul Celan, who forms this axis, and number 24 Am Karlsbad, the Mies van der Rohe Memorial. And here are what I call these marriage lines, which connect various people like Rachel Varnhagen together with Friedrich Schleiermacher, and so on. So it is only an emblem of the kind of connections which are there made explicit in the organization of the plan and also of the windows and the lighting of the museum in particular. That's the early model from the competition stage. In black it shows the courthouse, museum building, the zigzag, what I call the voided voids, which are the elements that have been extracted from this zigzag, and the E.T.A. Hoffmann garden. And it is, I call it the E.T.A. Hoffmann garden because E.T.A. Hoffmann was one of the lawyers in this courthouse presenting cases during the day, but as you well know, writing about a different kind of Berlin at night. And that's a site plan. The tip of the building marks the curvature of the street. Here is the zigzag, here is the void. There's a proposal to narrow down Lindenstrasse. Here are the housing projects, a bit of the 19th century fragment of a building, more housing here. And to the south stands another important building in the plan of this museum, which is Eric Mendelssohn's metalworkers' headquarters. And I propose that this shape become a garden in the future. There is here a one-story police station, so it's not certain how this will be developed. And there is the sort of the three elements of the museum: the existing museum and the extension. As you see, there is no bridge connection. There is no connection between these two buildings. They stand very close to each other without any entrance. There is no door to the zigzag. Probably it's the largest building ever built without a doorway. The entrance programmatically has always been through the Baroque building, and the Baroque is the entrance to that particular history. Here is the void, which is this empty space, and here you have the little tunnels or bridges, which you can see stands in certain numerical relationship to the zigzag. It's not visible from the outside. It's only comprehensible from the inside of the building. And here's the underground with its kind of void placed in the building itself, leading underground to these three main axes. I said one axe leading to this dead end, the Holocaust tower, the other one leading to the Garden of Emigration, and the third, longest one, leading to the center of the building, which is the main stair and circulation system. I just want to say that the building has a kind of a doubling effect. From the outside, it looks very, very simple and has a narrative beginning and an end, thin and thick, and it's very, very strong and very easy to understand. But from the inside, it's completely different. It's actually a building which is hard to contain and keep together as one building because it is connected by this slice which one does not see, since it is not a slice upon which you enter. It's not even a slice upon which you leave. It's that element of imaginary organization, which of course is there also physically. And the building therefore has a very vulnerable organization on the inside, while it has a very simple and easy to understand organization on the outside. And of course this is part of my own interpretation of Berlin history, that from the outside it looks very graphic, like it's something very tangible, but as you go into it and as the light dims on that history, one finds it more and more difficult to really find the pieces which belong together. And of course, the pieces which belong together are the pieces of the Berlin culture, which we can hardly find today because no artifact can tell us somehow how these conditions of life were mirrored in the city of Berlin. So it is really a museum for the participant. It involves the participant in a particular way to reinterpret the history rather than to simply be a passive observer of archaeology. This is a site plan of the museum. I just want to show again Mendelssohn's building here, the 19th century building, the housing projects east and west, the IBA buildings to the north, and the flower market, and so on. View looking from approximately where the rondel was. Today it has been totally built up by housing areas. And that is also an early model of the building. I just want to point that the building is really many different buildings of many different shapes. There are buildings of this shape and buildings of this shape, and there's another one here, and there's a building like that, and there is a very small triangular building. There are a number of independent buildings which are connected by that double wall of the void. And here are the bridges on different levels, and so on. That too is an important part of the building, that the void gives the building a kind of a backbone in order to turn the building into a fragmentation of many different buildings, each one having some relationship to, I would say, Berlin, both in its exterior and interior space, from sort of tenement kinds of buildings to large housing projects towards the east. And that, for example, is the first segment of that sequence of development. Is the first piece of that zigzag. And you see here along its upper levels, there's of course the underground, which is not shown in this model, but here is a small triangular building, here is the rest of the museum, here is the bridges on all levels, and here is the writing. And here is the second void, and so on. And the museum continues in this manner, but always from the middle, not from the beginning, because if you remember, you enter the building in the middle. You don't enter at the beginning or the end. You enter in the middle, and you have by that time traversed a large underground space. That is the underground. I'm sorry, the slide doesn't seem to be very good, but you see the southern wing of the Baroque building. You see there a bit of that void in that building, and this is the main line of circulation. That's the beginning of the staircase. The garden, the voided void, the religious collections of the Jewish community in Berlin will be shown in the underground. And there was a very ancient community, one of the oldest in Berlin, which is here. There are other facilities in the underground, other bits of the museum, also storage and other parts of the museum which are also accessible to the public in part. That's the underground. And now I have to show you a number of different kinds of things because I have found that it is not an easy project to explain. Because it's one of those projects where the plan has no relationship to the spatial experience. I want to emphasize this. Usually plans in architecture are simply projected into the spatial experience. In this case, because the approach is thoroughly emblematic, the actual plan doesn't really give you what you will feel, and therefore I have made maybe more than 60 or 70 different models from so site models at 1 to 200, 1 to 500, to actually a one-to-one piece of the void and piece of the underground, which was recently built in the Berlin Museum as a kind of experiment to test materials. So please bear with me if it's not completely transparent. That's the underground. The entrance to the main entrance of the Baroque building. Here you go down. You go actually underneath the foundations of the Baroque building. And as you perhaps know, the buildings in Berlin are built on water. There's a lot of water, sand and water. And here when you go down, you see that you kind of see the geology of Berlin. You see that it's really floating. And you go underneath this foundation very deep, 8 meters down, and you come through this axial system. There is that religious collection. And I have to say that on the underground, the zigzag breaks itself into pure forms. I call it the buried constructivism of Berlin. Because here on the underground, the zigzag is actually can be experienced as a set of pure volumes, just lines, which upstairs are connected, and therefore one doesn't see those pure elements any longer. So they are experienceable as pure lines in this hidden zone. And here are the traces of the voids which go all the way up about 22 meters high, and the axis. And there at the top of the slide would be the beginning of the main staircase. And that tilted form is the garden, the E.T.A. Hoffmann garden. The Berlin Museum at present with this form, the entrance. That was, by the way, programmatically part of the program to make the Berlin Museum, to restore it as much as possible to become an important building. And I actually proposed to restore its symmetry, although I inserted this large form into it. But it was reconstructed after the war in a not symmetrical way, and I proposed to reconstruct it close to what it was with going down and in section. And you can see here, you would be able to view this level here. And at this point begins those that labyrinth. Okay, going down. And that's another model just to give you a relationship of these voids in the underground to the main circulation system, which is here. That's, if you can imagine the zigzag going like that, that's the middle of the zigzag, and it keeps going this way. And that's the exact geometric middle of it, where you are on the staircase, and there are the different exhibition levels. Here is a construction of the two voids, and the reversal of that void, you can see this is the positive form of this negative absence. The one going here, the one going here, and the garden would be here. There you perhaps see clearly the religious collections, or whatever remains of them. Actually, what remains of them is very little. Don't think of religious collections as being some fabulous museum of artifacts. It's just a few menorahs and just really things that would never give you the idea that almost 200,000 people and very, very actively involved in the city actually were part of the city. So it's not so much about the object, it's about, in this particular section, it's the display actually of the tombstones which were extracted from building a U-Bahn station in the 30s. They actually have been preserved, and I found them, and that's part of this museum. And here you can see these, the scale of these voids, and there are 6 of them in the museum, and they are different in size, length, but always the same in height. And you can see the bridges, which you would experience. I should say Yes, maybe this is easier. That's a view from the south, looking towards that underground. And I would say almost 1/3 of the building, at least in cost proportions, is underground. It's difficult to build underground, but it has a very vast foundation, this building. On the outside, it looks fairly thin, but on the bottom, it's substantial. And this is what you would see when you would have gone a little way into this axial, into this kind of triangle. Here is that main stair. Here is the axis towards the garden, and here you see the lighting system reflecting that longer axis, which leads to the dead end. And again, I think programmatically it's important to know that there is a kind of order here, but it's an order that one must find, because it's also conceivable that some people will, seeing the light of the garden, will move towards the garden as the main space, but it's just being out again of the building. Others might take the transversal axis, which leads to a volume, and still others might take the staircase itself. I've tried to minimize any disorientation in the building. However, I have to say that there is an element in this building of vulnerability. It's not all given in plan, and even if one would give it in plan, I think people would still sometimes return once again, sometimes involuntarily, in the system of geometry. That's just to show you where the photograph was taken. It was taken approximately from this point here. And this axis is still going back there. And we were looking at this, and that lighting of this axis here. And at a bit of this frontal part. That's another axis. And on the right is the opening to the Jewish Museum. And when you enter this museum underground, you see partly here the void. That black line, actually the void is accessible in two places in the museum. In the two underground spaces of the religious part of the collections, you can see, and it's the only time you can see, the full organization of that volume. Everywhere else there are slits and cutouts, but one can hardly look into a dark mass and know what it is geometrically. And the material of it is graphite, so it absorbs light. And even the names which are in it are not really completely legible, because you can't read that many names. And I was interested to find out that how much those thousands of pages of volumes, if you were to just cut out the pages, and they take up an incredible amount of volume. These two volumes, approximately this thick, don't even fill two 22-meter high volumes, which are sometimes 10 meters wide. That's looking back towards the axis, and here is the void, the black ground. Here you would be able to see how thin and narrow it would be to be in it, but also in these two particular voids there is light coming in. You cannot see it in this model. And that's looking through the void, and you can see that it's a kind of multiplication of darkness or mirror-like effect, even though it is extremely flat. And looking back there is more of the void, and looking through here is the axis leading to the Holocaust Tower. Then there is that axis. On this axis there is not that much to show. Although it starts out just like all the other axes, well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's hard to retrospectively look at a dead end. One cannot see that people couldn't see that it was a dead end walking down it. And that's what I've tried to do also in whatever I have been able to contribute to the actual exhibition organization of the museum. That it would not be apparent how one would get to such a acute angle. And this particular building is just a building. I don't really think it's even a building. It's an extremely narrow angle. I think it's 15 degrees. It has this light, that cutout is the window, and the access would have been here, you would have entered it. In this memorial void, I propose to bury the archives, which have no real usefulness, the archives which contain the last signatures of, they have been preserved, of all the citizens that were deported and murdered. They are absolutely in the archives of Berlin. They are also photographed, and they should be used by scholars and other people, but the archives themselves, I believe, should be lodged in this place. And I have been in discussion with the Berlin Senate, and they are not unsympathetic to finding a permanent place for these thousands and thousands of signatures. And perhaps what one could show is the transformation of the signature as one walks on that axis, how the signature, and one could do it really graphologically, how the geometry of that signature takes on very acute connotations. That's that void. And we entered through here. Through here. The stair. And now looking from the opposite side of the garden. And now the garden is these pillars of, these 48 pillars of salt. But they are not made out of salt. But they relate to the mines of Falun as they relate to Jerusalem. And they are proposed to be built in this gray, white gray stone from Jerusalem. It's a kind of a very full building volume which confronts you on a very oblique angle as you leave the museum from that particular route. And here you perhaps sense the kind of space. It's a labyrinth without any interior to it. And here we rejoin again the access towards the main staircase and getting closer to it in plan to the center of the building. And now you're up on the staircase, and there are these levels, the temporary exhibitions level, which will house temporary exhibits of the Berlin Museum, and the other two levels of the museum. And upstairs is an administrative level which contains reading rooms, archives, and offices. In section, the main entrance to the building, the entrance to the underground, this tilted plane, and I have in no way to explain this, but this entire trigonometry of these axes lies on an oblique plane, which is very, very disturbing. It's not oblique by a lot, it's only a few degrees, but you really feel, I think, and as I explained, we have just built part of it at 1-to-1 scale, approximately the size of this room. And it verifies, I think, what I tried to do, which is to embody in it a thought of Franz Kafka, which is that the most dangerous space is not the space which is high up, but the space which is approximately 4 centimeters from your foot. And he says that's the space which really trips all concepts. And I thought that this plane, it's about a 4 centimeter slope, gets you to these voids here. And here you see in elevation, in the cutouts, those recordings of what I call the intermarriage of Berlin. And of course the marriage, I don't mean it just in an alchemical sense, but the marriage, the intermarriage between Jews who thought they were Germans and Germans who thought they were Jews, is part of the essential ambiguity and tragedy of the history of that city, and of this city, of any city, but particularly Berlin. And this assimilation is constituted in the lighting system of the windows. So what appears maybe a little bit crazy from the outside is a very important, at least to me, principle of organizing and making sense out of vanished relationships and vanished physical ambience, which you cannot see by the window or by looking at a monument of a street. That's the stair, and I want to say that only where the main orientation occurs at the stair do you actually see the contradiction between such a void and such a continuity. Can I press the next slide? Yeah. Can I press the next slide, or? Did that slide not want to be? I'm sure there is a slide. Okay, but don't worry about it. I can just skip it. So shall I? Fine. That's looking up from the second exhibition level. The slide has been reversed this way. That's the outside of the building. Those are those exhibition levels. That's the underground. That's the void, and that's the light. It's a typical museum floor. Elevators, staircases, and so on are basically freestanding objects within this. That's the line of circulation. The other, just to see what that void looks like in another plan, and so on. And that's what it looks like in that. That's one part of it. That's that middle portion. I just want to illustrate what it looks like spatially with its elevators. It's. You can see that this double wall has a very big impact on the building because, first of all, the entrances to this double wall, which is the wall of the void, are always symmetrical. It's the only place in the building where there is a left and a right. Always a left and a right. Whenever you come to graphite, you have a left and a right, and you have a kind of continuity in the form of a mirror. And the rest of it, the rest of the museum spaces are always one blank wall, at least, and one angle. And I thought really programmatically that these conditions of looking at the Berlin history from an angle towards a wall which is symmetrical, were important. So in each space, you're always looking from an angle of some shape towards a symmetrical entrance-exit situation. And I should probably describe to you that this is not a concept that is just a whimsical one, but has to do with what kind of exhibits this museum has. This is not an art museum. This is not the Museum of Paris or of London. This is not a museum of a normal city. This is a museum of a city which has the most amazing and schizoid hysterical history, which cannot be shown in any other simple way, but I believe by putting the museum goer exactly into those conditions without simulating them. So, for example, if one was to display a painting by Max Liebermann, on one side of the void, and that's the idea of it, on the other side of that same wall, on the inside of it, so to speak, one would see the suicide note of his wife, written from a concentration camp in 1940. If one was to show the books of Walter Benjamin on one side, then one would show the missing manuscript of Walter Benjamin's, which he lost somewhere in Spain. If one was to show Schoenberg's notes for Moses and Aaron, one would have to show on the other side of that music the survivor from Warsaw. So all of this doubling has to do with the fact that I believe no Solomon can actually divide the Berliner into a German and a Jew, since it's not possible to divide them along any line of geometry. They have coagulated and therefore can only be separated through negativity. Of course, one can say that Walter Benjamin becomes a Jew and is no longer a Berliner when he gives the manuscript up and commits suicide. That that Max Liebermann is no longer the head of the academy when his wife begs for permission out of a concentration camp, or where Arnold Schoenberg renounces his conversion to Protestantism and becomes a Jew once again. That's really the mission of such a museum, how to show a history in an integrated manner, not in a segregated manner, not in a manner which would put the Jewish Museum somewhere as an ethnographic museum of a missing people, of a lost people, but would show the continuity of that history and the power of that history within the emptiness of the contemporary state. And of course, that is just a small aside to why the museum has this particular set of organs. That's just a walk between two voids along the porcelain line. And that's the porcelain Hof, the porcelain courtyard. And I would just like to show you what it would feel like in this particular segment of the building. That's the first piece along that line. Second piece, you go around. Third one, you become aware of the void, or of the wall, the black wall in the back of this white museum. The museum is in three colors. It's in black, white, and gray, basically. Then you get closer to it. Well, something is wrong with this. But can I just go on? Yeah, there was one more. Now, can you go back to that section? No, don't worry about putting the slide back. That slide which was missing, which somehow is not wanting to project itself, is the slide where you would get the symmetry of the doorways on that black wall, where you would get a complete, very simple left and right, which is a kind of the geometry of the return. And here is the return as it appears in sections. These are the what I would call these other kinds of buildings, these black buildings, which are also structurally supporting those other shapes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These buildings, I wouldn't say they are negative buildings, but are actually the positive sustaining of those apparently eccentric geometries. And these are the bridges in section. And the numerical and numerological aspect is very important in this museum. I don't have time to go into it, but I did try to interpret both Walter Benjamin and Schoenberg, in particular, in a certain numerical emblematic tradition. And I think this is important. That's why the museum has 24 elevations. It has 177 windows and so on. It's part of it. And some people say, well, will everybody know about it? Probably not. But it wouldn't really invalidate the fact that I sought to make the museum an interpreter of these texts rather than be interpreted by those texts. That's, for example, how on the administrative level, the rhythm of void, window, and blank wall would look like. That's just a portion, and I have many of these drawings, which I don't want to bore you with. That's the last void, void number 6. It's the longest one, and again, that last one is also accessible in a different way from the first two, from the temporary exhibitions area. And here I think you see that it's really a building in itself of some substance and some cost. And this is an important factor because who wants to pay for a void? When it comes to money and budgets, I think the most important thing is to convince somebody to pay for nothing. But I have to say that I got my courage to do this. Well, I would never have been able to do it without my wife Nina, who helped in the political argumentation. But I have to say Wittgenstein gave a very good example of it. He said that nothing is not really nothing. It's a word. And he said the minute it's a word, you can use it as a linguistic piece of analysis. So I used the same logic. I said, well, the void is not really nothing because, of course, the Senate of Berlin said the void costs so many millions. And it's all this cubic volume of space which is being built, and no one will ever know it's there. It will be just as much of a void if you compress it and make it into nothing. just call it a void. But I said no. Arguing in a Wittgensteinian manner, I said that in architecture, the analysis of that physicality would really be the fact that it's not nothing. It's really 1/3 of the architecture. And I was lucky that people in Berlin also understood that this is not a conceptual museum. That's how it would look passing across one of the bridges, one of the many, many bridges. And they're all different. They have different, if you looked at the plan, they have different shapes and different lengths. This is a slot, a cut of space. I also have now added a small cut on the bottom for kids and for people who cannot view it at that level. But it's interesting what you would see, because I cannot describe it exactly, and I don't have a successful photograph of the one-to-one model, but you see something that looks like it's not there, but looks very far away from you. That's the impact, because it's in fact very close. On the other side, some 10 meters away, 8 meters away, is another one of these bridges. So you are very close to the other side, but you can't form a physical distance to it, and you don't know whether it's very far and very close. And I think that's the concept of the void. You don't know, one doesn't know, whether it's far away or whether it's on this side already. And that's the elevations. This is the elevation looking from Lindenstrasse on the upper side, and elevation looking at the voided void here from the south, from the Mendelssohn building, so to speak. And the cuts, angles of the different parts of the building. I should mention that this line of absence or line of inaccess traverses all different exhibits, because the museum is not only a painting museum, it has large collections, the largest collection in Berlin of textile and fashion. Garment industry was one of the biggest businesses of Berlin. Before the war, many of the leading protagonists were Jewish businessmen and Jewish tailors. There is also a large theater collection and cinema, which includes paraphernalia and manuscripts and so on. There are toys, articles of everyday life. It's a mixed. It's a very strange museum, because it's a museum that itself is a product of an accident of what survived. These are the elevations from the east and from the north. Again, marking this invisible interconnection of basically of names and numbers. And that's a view from Lindenstrasse, with the IBA buildings in the north, and these are the existing trees which have all been kept, and I've kept as many trees as possible within this configuration, because it's part of a kind of a green zone for pedestrians and for bicycles, connecting Kreuzberg and other parts of Berlin. It's a view from the housing complexes. That's the unfolding of the windows from the south and from the north. But I just want to say that it's not just about leaving traces, it's also about making windows, which bring in different kind of light. And to be aware of that light and to be aware of the constellations of that light is very important to me. And these windows open along different levels of, well, they are open and closed permanently along these lines. So if you stand in particular places, one would see what initially appears very irrational, sort of like looking at a bit of a cemetery on one side, and on the other side looking at a particular window of a housing project, let's say, or looking at an open territory where the flower market is and sort of Berlin, and on the other side looking at a small streets that remain between these other houses. And one is actually looking, and that's what the museum is. One is looking, and also one is lighting, illuminating the particular exhibits within this range of obscurity. because programmatically the museum is not supposed to have a lot of light. They didn't want a lot of light. But I thought that light should enter along specific angles. So again, the light, like the form itself, from the outside, the building is zinc, is cut in on a diagonal. The windows are cuts, diagonal cuts through the building, slivers of planes, which in an imaginary way penetrate through the person. But on the inside, they are fractured. So that's the window from the inside. And of course, it's one thing to invent a window, but another thing is to meet the DIN norms in Germany to make a window workable. And I have to say that I've never known how interesting it could be to make a window. I thought, when I was in school, I thought this was not such an interesting part of my studies, but I've come to realize that really, to make a good window, well, I haven't yet made a door, as I said, because there's no door, but to make a window, at first, is a great challenge. And yeah, that's the Porzellanhof and it's dedicated to porcelain. I wanted to make the darkest courtyard. In early stages, people said, well, isn't it going to be a little unpleasant to be in this courtyard? Isn't it going to be dark? And I said, no, it's a kind of darkness that is very much part of the ambience of these courtyards and these staircases in Berlin, which are all through Kreuzberg, well, still remain, some of them. So each part of this internal form has also generated particular spaces of meditation and exposure. Again, from Lindenstrasse, that white building just gives you the scale of these vast buildings that continue behind it. And that's the view from the Mendelssohn building. And I always thought this was the front entrance to the building, although I designed the building before the wall and the main station was at Mehringplatz, at the Rondell. I knew that architecturally the building is really set up, the Baroque building is set up by Schinkel's geometry to become the object. So I only kind of bracketed it with this very narrow tip of the building, which also contains one of the main tip staircases between the exhibition levels. And I guess that's really my interest. That's where I started, and that's where I'm still working on the project. I started with the name Berlin. I don't know whether it appears. It does appear. I don't know. Berlin and Berliner seem to have covered, incredible number of pages. Somehow Jews adopted the name Berlin and Berliner en masse, more than even the name Schiller. Jews took the name Berliner. I started with it, and somehow I believe that the museum is about the names, is about the fact that the names don't do anything. Thank you very much.
In the tradition of the John Dennys lecture, there'll be no questions. Those who are joining us for supper should make their way to the library now. And Daniel, thank you very much indeed.